I love studying the lives of soldiers in the 18th century, especially the everyday soldier. What was their life like? What did they wear? What did they eat? How did they cook it? And that's exactly what this episode is about. We're talking specifically here about soldiers in the War of 1812 and the ingenuity they needed to survive in the field with their equipment and with their food. At the very beginning of the War of 1812, before it even started, before America declared war, they decided they were going to send a military force up to Detroit and possibly attack Canada. And they sent a man called General Hull from Ohio with some troops to do that very thing. He wasn't maybe a very good general. As they were going up there, they get close to Detroit, he decides to send his personal papers, the plans, the declaration of war, some equipment, all their provisions on board a schooner to go the rest of the way. And that schooner was captured by the British. They knew his plans, they had his provisions, and some of their equipment. The soldiers go on to Detroit, but they are immediately in need of resupply. And General Hull sends back down to the Cincinnati area for more supplies, and he says, definitely send men to guard those supplies as they come up to us. And that's where this story really starts. There's a gentleman down in that area in Chillicothe, Ohio, called Samuel Williams. He was a resident of that area. The governor in that area, he comes forward and he says, these men need resupply up in Detroit. We need to raise an immediate force. We need to raise a militia to guard these supplies to go up there. And 100 men volunteer on the spot. And within 24 hours, they were equipped. They had a uniform, they had officers, they had everything they needed so that they could go and march off and take these supplies to Detroit. Now, as they're going up there, Mr. Williams writes letters to his wife. He describes the lives of these soldiers and exactly what they're doing. He also kind of gives us a history. And that's where this story really starts. He talks about the equipment, and I'm wearing basically the equipment they had. They had natural linen trousers, they had natural linen hunting frocks, they had a special hat with a special button on the side of it, they had tomahawks and knives and guns and all the equipment they would need for that. But you know what he didn't list? They didn't have tents and they didn't have any cooking implements. And so he gives us a description about exactly how they eat and how they're cooking the minimal provisions that they had, which they just had some flour and they had some bacon and salt. That is it. That's all the soldiers had to live with. He even complains a lot that they didn't really have any water and that they would just kind of get water out of the ruts in the road. And these men were not professional soldiers. They just volunteered for this job. They just had regular jobs at home right there in that Cincinnati area. And so it was a tough haul. They were marching 20 and 30 miles a day. These men were not ready for that kind of activity. Now, it is a kind of a sad story because they get very close to Detroit, but the British have surrounded the fort up there. And eventually the general surrenders to the British, and he surrenders these men that haven't even made it to Detroit yet. They decide that they are not going into captivity. They turn around and head right back to Cincinnati. Here he's talking about the water they had available. He says, along the route at this point, the expedition continued to suffer greatly from want of good water, being obliged to drink out of puddles along the roadside and use pond water for cooking. And let's talk about this cooking. They had no equipment. He talks about one single kettle, and what they really have for equipment are their tomahawks and their knives so that they can make their own cooking implements, just like we're doing here. Cutting sticks down and cooking on them, doing whatever ingenuity that these soldiers had to do. In Samuel Williams' narration, he gives us an amazing description of their food and how they cook it. This is rare that we will get this first-person account that gets into such detail and is so helpful that we can reproduce it right here. He says, "You will smile at our mode of cooking, could you see us thus employed. Our company is divided into messes of 6 men each. Our rations are delivered together to each mess when we encamp at night. This consists of flour, fat bacon, and salt. The flour is kneaded in a broad iron kettle and is drawn out in long rolls the size of a man's wrist and is coiled around a smooth pole, sometimes 3 inches in diameter and 5 or 6 feet long, on which the dough is flattened so it is to be a ½ an inch thick or more in thickness. The pole is thus covered with dough except for a few inches at each end. It is placed on 2 wooden forks driven in the ground in front of the campfire and is turned frequently till it is baked. When it is cut off in pieces, the pole is covered again, thus in the same manner, and baked. Our meat is cooked thus. A branch of the tree having several twigs on it is cut. The ends of the twigs are sharpened. The fat bacon is cut in slices and stuck on these twigs, leaving a little space between each. Each man is then given a piece of the pole bread and lays thereon a slice of bacon. With his knife he cuts therefrom and eats his meal with good appetite. They're making bacon sandwiches and they're making the bread on a stick. That is exactly what we're going to try to reproduce here today. First, let's mix up the dough. This is just like what we normally do for fire cakes and even ship's biscuit. We're going to take our flour, we're going to mix in a little bit of salt, and then we're going to take water and stir that in until we make a thick, sticky paste or dough. The directions seem to imply that this was done per mess. So each group of 6 men would probably have their own campfire and their own stick. I've preheated this stick over the fire and it's warm from about here to here. I'm not going to put dough out toward the edges. He talked about, really stretching it all the way out. They would have to have a fairly long and very warm fire pit to do this. That's the problem with this, is that it's easy to make the fire consistent over a small distance, but it's much harder to do it over a large distance. But we'll do our best. We're going to take our dough that's nice and soft and start to wrap it around the stick in a coil fashion from one end to the other. You might have to press this in and glue it together a little bit so it doesn't try to uncoil itself, but this wraps on here very, very easily. We can smash it down until it gets to about that ½ inch thick that he talks about. And once that's wrapped all the way around, we do want to get enough on here to make a difference. So this is about 18 inches or 24 inches of dough from one end to the other. This is probably going to work out just fine. Might not be in the perfect spot, but we'll get this on the fire. It'll really be interesting how quickly it's going to bake. And I'll build this fire up a little bit so that it gets a little bit warmer. We kind of slow cooked this bread on the fire this kind of height. I didn't want to blister it. We did have a little bit of that going on here, but that's very, very typical for this kind of baking. And I think it's turned out really well. So it's nice and warm and very consistent. I didn't have to rotate it very often. The stick did warm up, so it should be cooked basically all the way through. And we won't know until we cut this off, but I'm just gonna slice it down and kind of peel it off and see how it turns out. The nice thing about this is, unlike fire cakes, when you're cooking them on the coals, you have to be right there constantly working them. This, it's up off the fire enough that we can set it on the fire, come back 5 minutes later, rotate it a little bit. So it's actually very easy to do. This bread turned out well for having absolutely no equipment but the sticks that we bring out of the woods. And yes, it's a little doughy on the inside here, but that's very, very typical for these fire cakes. So let's find out how it tastes. It's got a great texture. I probably added a touch too much salt. I can imagine the soldiers in that setting wouldn't have had any problem with that. This would be the perfect bread substitute when you don't have real bread and you're on the march. The stories about the difficulties that these men had, they would cook all this stuff up in the evening and they would keep it for the next day. And then at the end of that day, cook more. This is a wonderful experiment and it turned out better than I expected.